It's 2 days after St. Patrick's Day. We're in a central part of the downtown in an area known as the Oregon District. At 6 p.m., the police department gets a call from a woman who is very distressed.
I see Mrs. Ferrara, and she pretty much said she was afraid to go in. I entered the bar. I walked around the corner. All of a sudden, it hit me.
He finds a body in a pool of his own blood.
I waited for a second for my partner to arrive. So we go down the hall a little bit further. And there's another body face down.
The person who did this crime knows these people. He still thinks that somehow he can get away with this. Oh, please. If you think this is going to end well, you're sorely mistaken. When Kane busted a cap and Abel, did he send a uniform to take the report? No, he sent a f***ing detective.
I'm a retired homicide detective from the Dayton Police Department. In my 22 years in homicide in Dayton, I was directly involved in over 800 homicide investigations. I grew up on the east end of Dayton. I went to Dayton public schools. In high school, we'd all go and watch the football game. And just unexpectedly, someone pulled out a knife and stabbed one of our coaches to death for no reason. I'd never seen anything like that before, and I was kind of intrigued by it. Years later, I knew this police officer, and we got to be friends. And one day he said, why don't you come and ride along with me for a night? You might get a kick out of it. And that got me hooked. The next day, I'm like, this is what I'm going to be. And I became a homicide detective. Homicide is the gold level of police work, bar none. We're the CEO of these investigations, and it's a great responsibility.
Detective Burke is a hard worker. Many times I would laugh because he would seem to be doing 18 things at one time, answering the phone, talking to somebody. He'd always call the victims' families. He knew it was important.
Doyle Burke had the respect of all the police officers, supervisors, everybody. He was very, very good with people, and he was sincere with it.
It's not easy, but if I had been an engineer, I'd have been bored to death. There's no doubt in my mind. This is much better. The day we got the call, we had a Klan rally, which is a rarity in Dayton.
The Ku Klux Klan is a white supremacist organization that came into being in the 19th century. They ruled in their minds the master race. It advanced through the country like a pox. It tends to attract the dim-witted who are easily influenced.
They have a First Amendment right, but they're bringing an awful, ugly message that we don't want associated in any way with our city. It's a city that was, at the time, probably 40% black. Most people were not happy to see them.
And that is potentially violent. So they had hundreds of Dayton police officers to contain what was thought to be, maybe 100,000 people. They left me and my partner as the only two guys not in uniform in case we got a homicide. And they go, well, you've got a homicide. And I said, oh, was it the Klan rally? And they go, oh, no, we've got two people that are beaten to death inside Sloopy's bar.
So it still could be the case that this was racially motivated. But he wondered about that. Burke is a smart guy. The real key to any investigation is to keep an open mind.
The Oregon District is the main entertainment district. You had a number of bars, so if you went to one and it was crowded, you could just wander down to the other.
The flagship in that time was Sloopy's. When I got to the scene of Sloopy's, I talked to Officer Keller, and he described to me the bar was not open at the time, that we had 2 victims. The side door where we went in led to the kitchen area.
The first victim, they check his wallet, and detectives identify him as one Robert Napke, 38 years of age. A relatively young man.
Robert Napke was my first concern because he was closest to the door by the walk-in freezer. He was beaten in the back of the head 17, 18 times.
The killer hit him repeatedly with this instrument, whatever it is. A shell fracture of the entire skull. This is a classic case of overkill.
In cases like this, you have what you physically have, and then you have what it means. So yes, we have a dead guy. He's been hit on the back of the head with something, and he fell face first. That's static. But what does it mean? It means the suspect was behind him. It means he probably opened that door for him, and he knew him enough to where he trusted him enough to walk in front of him. I'm convinced to this day, Napke was totally caught off guard. The suspect just beat him to death. The other victim was laid out on top of his coat. And his injuries were identical to Robert Napke's. He's beaten to death in the back of the head. The autopsy later revealed that the second victim had 19 blows to the head, very violent.
Keller then points out something to Burke.
And there was a wallet hidden behind the toilet tank.
The wallet belongs to our second victim, Frank Ferraro, a man 65 years of age and the husband of Mrs. Ferraro, the 911 caller.
His wallet had all his ID and $211 in cash.
Detectives, I believe Frank must have had a hunch, I'm going to get robbed. So he removed his personal wallet, put it behind the toilet so the robber wouldn't get his wallet.
We went to the office area. And in the office area was a hammer. We could see that it had some blood on it and what appeared to be hair on it. Hopefully we can get some DNA, fingerprints, whatever off of it.
Obviously, this is our weapon. Humans are fragile. They're damaged easily. You've got a hammer in your hand and you are at the edge of rage. You are a killing machine.
It'd be silly to say that things like this don't bother you, but you have to go to kind of the greater good. This is what I do. And yes, this is horrible. How much worse will it be if we don't get who did this?
So Detective Burke speaks to Grace Ferraro, the victim's wife. Grace explains her husband was an Army veteran, 44 years in the Postal Service, decided to want to continue to work. His sons owned Sloopy's. Dad wanted a job. The sons decided to provide him with one. Let him be the day manager. Let him keep the books.
His wife, Grace, loved him with all her heart and just could not understand how her love of her life could be taken away.
Robert Napke was relatively young, in his late 30s. He was known in the Oregon District by everyone. He was the general laborer guy. He was a jack of all trades. No one had anything bad to say about him.
My name is Jim Napke, and I am Robert Napke's brother. Robert was the fifth of 9 children. He was someone who could easily make friends. A lot of people wanted to be around him. Robert was very trustworthy, and he expected you to be trustworthy also. At Sloopy's, he was in charge of janitorial, custodial type work. Robert, as far as I know, didn't have any problems or issues working at Sloopy's. He wanted to keep his life pretty simple. As long as he had his friends, he was happy with that. With Robert's death, it was after midnight, and my sisters called me and told me the news he had been beaten to death. We were all shocked, what happened. Nightmare.
It's always difficult to come to grips with what's occurred. Neither of the families had a clue why these two men were killed. Knowing that it's Dayton, that there's a Klan rally, it's right after St. Patrick's Day, I knew there was going to be a lot of work to figure out who did this just by virtue of what it was. So my partner and I are on scene at Sloopy's. Got a page from dispatch. I called in. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, right? Like, okay, we'll take care of it. They go, got another double homicide.
Double homicides are rare. Double homicides within an hour of each other are incredibly rare. So now Burke has another complication. What if they are connected? Do we have somebody roaming around the city killing people? What are the odds of that? I would say they'd be very high. Detective Joel Burke is working a double homicide at Sloopy's bar. And he's just learned of yet another double homicide 15 miles away in a convenience store.
My partner, he's like, this is a joke, right? And I'm like, no, it's not a joke.
What do we do if this is an ongoing event and we're going to keep finding bodies?
With these two double homicides occurring like that in the same time frame, until you've got a suspect identified and cuffed, everything's in play. Anything's possible.
When Burke hears about this other double homicide, he's not going to rely on someone else's opinion. He's going to rely on his own. He wants to go to that scene and look for himself. What is the same here?
It was a very small mom-and-pop carryout. Both of the clerks had been shot and killed. Cash drawer was gone. I mean, it was an obvious robbery.
Someone comes unstuck and they open fire. Burke is hopeful there's not another one in the next hour, but we'll see. It puts the pressure up. There are similarities in these two cases, but the most important thing is the manner of death. They were both shot to death with a handgun from some distance away. Not the same as beating somebody to death right in front of your face. It's a different kind of crime.
The way things were done up at the carryout led you to believe they weren't connected, and ultimately it was not related.
Later, 3 men were arrested for that double homicide, and all of them were convicted. And there was no question it had nothing to do with Sloopy's bar murders. So now Burke is back to Sloopy's bar to talk to the night manager, who relieves Ferraro when he leaves during the day.
I said, I need a list of all your current and former employees. He goes, fine. But everybody does everything. What are you talking about? Everybody does everything. He goes, the Oregon District, every bar here works with every bar here.
It's an informal alliance.
If somebody was running out of a certain product or somebody was low on cash for whatever reason, a different bar owner might help them.
Sloopy's is the biggest, and TB Hopkins is the second biggest. So the employees from Hopkins routinely come over to Sloopy's because it's very close.
One of the other things we learned is now the Oregon District is famous for its Halloween party. What I didn't realize is St. Patrick's Day was right behind it. That was the number 2 moneymaker.
St. Patrick's Day is a unique American holiday. Everybody gets toilet-hugging, snot-licking drunk, and they'll stay that way for a week, both in advance of, the day of, and a week after. The bars make 6 months of their income in about 2 weeks.
When you were drinking in those bars, you were probably paying with cash because it was a cash business.
The manager was a wealth of information. We had a lot of questions.
One key to any investigation is to establish a time of death. The last person to see him alive, Ferraro, was his wife. She said her husband left that morning at 5 a.m. to go to the bar, clean up. At 6 p.m., he's dead. That's 12 hours later. So to narrow that down to a period of an hour or 2 is very significant.
Obviously, we couldn't let the manager into the bar. We had to preserve the integrity of the scene. We had taken some photos.
Burke is experienced, and he's smart.
And I show him the bar stools on the tables, the office, and things I thought he could get an idea with what they were doing.
Burke says, how far along were they in the cleanup?
And then he goes, oh, they're nearing the end, so 10, 11 o'clock.
So the killer commits this crime between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning.
So that all fit, and that was very helpful. And then he's looking at the office, he goes, hey, our safe is missing. He goes, there should be a fire safe that sits right here.
The manager tells Burke, there's a safe here where the night manager, me, puts the receipts in the bank bags. And when Ferraro comes in the morning, he takes the bags to the bank.
Whoever did this thought that the safe would be stuffed with money because of St. Patrick's Day. And it would have been, but Frank had already made a deposit. So now we got a safe that's missing. I'm like, how big is this safe? He goes, it weighs about 150 pounds. I said, so one guy could carry it? He goes, oh, yeah.
So now we're faced with another problem. Is this a crime of opportunity after the murders? Our man is walking out. Well, hey, that's a safe. It's not that big. Or is this purpose of this crime the theft of this vault? Then how do you explain the savagery of the attack? We don't know. We weren't here. That's the disadvantage of being a homicide detective. You're never there when you should be. Burke knows the likelihood of finding this safe is slim to none. But nevertheless, he puts out a bolo on it. He's thorough. You have to be.
You work every case to its most logical conclusion. I was at my desk looking through things, trying to solve this. When I got a phone call from Chris Ingalls, a reporter for one of the local news stations. He says, I've got a letter I think you need to see. It may be related to the Sloopy's homicide. And I said, great, bring it on down.
So he comes down and shows Burke a letter addressed to him at the TV station.
There was a return address from the devil in hell. And it basically was a one-page note about how they had killed the 2 people at Sloopy's because they were mad because the city let the Klan rally come into town.
Dayton police lie when they say the killings are not related. Maybe not directly, but in rage.
I personally beat the young stupid one by the walk-in freezer, hit him a lot with one of my boys' tool. The old guy in the toilet, he died.
Maybe next time KKK want to come to Dayton, you say no. Maybe families ask, where was my police protection?
I tell them they protect the crackers at Rally. One day we really will overcome.
Street talk, mistakes, misspelled words.
There are pieces in here only the killer would know. the old guy in the toilet, Mr. Furrow died in the men's room, about the young boy by the freezer, that's the prep area.
But one most critical thing, he says a hammer. Why is that so important, you say? Well, because they never told the public what the weapon was. Yet this guy knows it's a hammer.
And we just thought this has got to be from the suspect.
Interesting. Who is our author? There's been an angry letter sent to the press alleging this murder is based on racial hatred.
And they had killed the two people at Sloopy's because they were mad because the city let the Klan rally come into town.
We will leave this courthouse.
We tend to think of the Klan as a Southern phenomenon, but when they were at their height in the 1920s, a lot of the biggest states for the Klan were actually in the Midwest. There was segregation everywhere. In Dayton, we had segregated schools, we had segregated swimming pools, so that existed up here.
They came here to incite to violence. They came here to spew their rhetoric and try to make people mad and try to get those people to do something.
Stop the Klan!
It was that morning of the murders, so that fits. Somebody incensed over the meeting and then goes off and kills people.
We had to at least theorize that maybe this is a retaliation for the Klan. I mean, what a coincidence.
Burke needs to find out what happened at this rally, so he finds the officers that were assigned to the detail.
I knew we had over 200 officers on duty there, and I talked to them. They go, I think we outnumbered the people there. Some people showed up, but boy, not in the numbers that we were expecting. So it was kind of a wash.
So now the only fact we have is that somebody wrote a letter to the press and knew things that had never been released to the public. The letter is undoubtedly from the killer.
Who would send such a letter was the first thing that got into my mind. And then the smarter part of me kicked in, and I said, could the guy that did this actually be dumb enough to try to do this to throw us off?
So Burke has decided this racial motivation is just probably not accurate at all. There's no evidence to support it. So now we're back to square one.
It was one of these paperwork days. I was at my desk looking through things. We got a call that a safe had been located behind one of the hardware stores.
Well, would you look at that? The safe was actually found, and someone pried it open.
It was a Sloopy safe. There was no doubt about it.
Now we've got something solid. We have an object that this person who's responsible for the crime touched and had in his possession.
So our evidence technicians took it to the crime lab and did an analysis on it.
In this case, the safe, they brought it in. Now, laboratory, what can you tell me about this? What did they use to break into it?
A 150-pound safe is more like having a secure lock on your closet. They don't require sophisticated effort to get into. They don't require somebody who knows how to manipulate a combination lock. All they require is force.
The lab people now take a look at it and they say, oh, I see, here's the Jimmy marks, and we're documenting those things. The safe, it didn't have fingerprints on it, but on the side of it, there's red paint.
It looked like a paint transfer, like the safe impacted against something that was painted red. It's anyone's guess at this point, but right now it's not helpful. What Burke needs is a suspect. Sloopy's Bar is such a landmark in this neighborhood of bars that people are still discussing this case days later. It is the talk of the town and of the press.
We had Crime Stoppers. We, of course, said, you know, with everything on the news, anybody with any information, call in about anything. I thought we would solve this, but you don't know. You just don't know, and it's tough to take. But every time we thought we were at our wits' end, we always had something. that would pull us back in the right direction.
Tips start to roll in, and several anonymous informants say that a guy named Edmund Emmerich III should be looked at by the police.
Edmund Emmerich III was a bouncer.
He worked at T.B. Hopkins' bar, which is practically next door to Sloopy's. Of course he knew Frank Ferraro and Robert Napke. He dealt with them all the time.
Now, you're not convicting a guy bag murder on that. But it makes him somebody you need to talk to.
He had a reputation as being a hothead. If someone mouthed off to him,
he would beat people half to death.
He was fired by the bar because he just was more trouble than he was worth. Now, Burke immediately thinks, hot temper, you say? Well, we are certainly looking for one of those. Burke decides to run Emmerich's name to see if anything comes up.
And lo and behold, Edmund Emmerich III, he was wanted on the traffic warrant.
Now Burke has something to work with. Let's see what you have to say for yourself, Mr. Emmerich. Now Burke is convinced he is on the right track. Now this gentleman, Edmund Emmerich III, has a traffic warrant.
So now we had him dumped in our lap.
Doyle was already legendary when I met him. He had that reputation to work a confession and just gradually trap them with their own words. And he was exceptionally good at that.
My thing is, everything's a battle, and I don't want to lose. I mean, I go into the room thinking, if I come out of here with nothing, they won. And I don't want them to win, so I want to get something.
Burke says he's investigating a double murder at Sloopy's and asks Emmerich, do you know Frank Ferraro and Robert Napke? No, I never heard of him.
If you worked down there, you had to know both those guys, especially Napke. He was in every inch of that Oregon district 7 days a week. Everybody knew Robert Napke.
He asks Emmerich where he was on March 19th. Now, this is 9 days after the date the bodies were discovered.
And he laid out everywhere he was, hour by hour by hour. And he started at 10 o'clock, I was at my dad's. Then I went to the Patterson Pony Cake and got a 6-pack of beer. Then I went to the Patterson Park Laundromat and got my clothes. I'm like, you pretty sure about all that? Yeah. In my mind, I'm like, oh, this is good. Nobody can remember this. No one. Why would you?
Emmerich is telling Burke a story as if he's rehearsed the story before. However, being suspicious doesn't give you the right to arrest anybody. He lets him go.
We went to the Pony Keg, and we felt like idiots, but we said, look, I know you probably sell 10 million bottles of beer in a week, but 2 weeks ago, a guy came in, bought a 6-pack of beer in the afternoon, and we showed him a photo spread. And he goes right to Emmerich's photo and says, yeah, that's him. He said, look at me and look at the clock and remember that I was here.
Now, the explanation of him being there is very bizarre, but the fact remains he was there. So that 12 to 2 checks out.
And we went to the laundromat, it was even better. The lady said, I remember him. Here's his name. And it was around 2 o'clock.
She said this same fellow makes a huge fuss about the fact he has to have this laundry.
He had 31 pounds of laundry, which is an immense amount of laundry. And she goes, he parked far away. And we're like, why don't you just pull it up again? He goes, no, I'm good.
Now, what is he doing? He's drawing attention to himself by raising a fuss. The clerk tells Burke she thought it was just kind of odd the way he acted. So I kind of looked out the window to see how he was going to get all that clothing into this car. Burke asked her, what kind of car does he have?
She goes, it was a little red Dodge Daytona.
Well, my. Red, like the kind that can produce a paint transfer on a safe. Mr. Emmerich has a great deal of explaining to do. However, Mr. Emmerich, he's been giving alibis all day long, and so far, they've all checked out. The last stop for Burke is Emmerich's father.
2 pounds of heroin was seized along
Now, they strongly believe these people were killed between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning. Emmerich said he was with his dad all morning, the most critical part of his alibi, which is the time frame of the murder.
We made it clear to Emmerich's father, you know, we're homicide detectives and we want to talk to you about your son, Eddie. And he was very cordial. I want to know if we want to have some coffee. And we talked for a while. He couldn't remember if he was there or not. And then he asked who we were again. And we told him. And then he asked us if we'd like to have some coffee. And it was clear that he had memory problem, maybe some dementia.
Burke believes Emmerich intentionally used his father as the final nail in his alibis, knowing that his father could not confirm nor deny that he was there.
He couldn't remember who we were, much less, you know, whether or not Emmerich was there on the 19th.
So his plan blows up in his face.
Once we showed the alibi was just crap, even though we now have a tremendous amount of suspicion on Emmerich, you have to have probable cause. So we had Emmerich's car towed to the crime lab.
They look at the car.
Oh my God, there's a whole gray scratch area on his vehicle. That's a clue. So we do an examination of the paint, number of layers and the color, do a side-by-side comparison and a chemical analysis.
Ken called me on over that they had some results.
These marks were made by that corner of that safe as was rubbed across this vehicle.
So now we had hard physical, forensic, scientific evidence that tied Emmerich to these two murders. There's no way you can explain that safe being in your car. It's irrefutable. In this case, it matched, and Emmerich was our man.
Police work is one foot in front of the other. It's paperwork by the metric ton. And yet, at the end, when you finally assemble this tonnage of information and you're going to go get your man, there's nothing better. Nothing. They go to Emmerich's house.
You always use an abundance of caution when you're going after a murder suspect, especially somebody this cocky and this brutal and violent.
Once you've killed once, after that it's only numbers.
We could see him looking out the front window. The good thing for us is this wasn't our first rodeo. We had officers in the back, so he's not getting out of the house.
And then you announce, police, open the door. Another knock, another announcement. Open the door, answer is no. Battering ram, goodbye door. Mr. Emmerich, let's see how the rest of your day is going to work out. Please open that house like a tuna can. We're going to scoop up Mr. Emmerich and haul him away.
We look through the house. We go through every room. He is in that house, but we can't find him in that house. And that's eerie because he's a murderer. He could jump out with a knife, who knows? So now we have to fine-tune the search. And as we're combing through the basement, we see a cellar door. And we saw that and we're like, that's got to be it.
And there is Mr. Emmerich, crouched like a little baby with his hands over his head, announcing, "Don't shoot."
There's a great deal of satisfaction when you know you've got the right guy. Well, I would have loved to have another crack at him in an interview room, but I don't think any of us felt that was ever going to happen.
And this man, Mr. Emmerich, he doesn't want to make a statement. Fine. Confessions are very rare, but if you don't have a case, don't arrest him. So, what motivated Emmerich to do this? Is it just his temper? Oh, that certainly helped. But Emmerich was desperate. He'd been fired from the job he had. He had no money.
Emmerich was familiar with the Oregon District and the fact that there would be a lot of money after St. Patrick's Day. He knew Sloopy's was the biggest bar at the time, and they had money, and he was going to take money.
What he doesn't know is that morning, Ferraro took the proceeds from the night before to the bank night depository. Emmerich thought he'd get all this money. Didn't happen.
That morning, he knew there'd be guys in there cleaning up. He knew one of them would probably be Robert because that's what Robert did.
Emmerich goes to the side door entrance. Napke thinks, well, it's Emmerich, assuming he's there for business.
I don't know if he went in there with the idea of, I'm going to have to eliminate any witnesses that I find, but they had no chance.
We speculate.
25 people.
Emmerich grabs a hammer out of a toolbox. And bludgeons Napke to death. And because of his temper, he goes crazy.
The autopsy revealed there's no defensive wounds. Robert never even saw it coming.
We theorized that Mr. Ferraro heard the commotion and thought it was a robbery. Ran into the men's room, stuffed his wallet between the toilet tank and the wall, turned and came out of the stall, and is confronted by Emmerich.
Frank was told to lay down there. Probably said, I'm not laying on that floor.
Ferraro said, let me use my jacket. The floor is filthy. And he let him do that because it took the fear away. That he's just going to lay down or he's not going to hurt me. And then he attacks him and kills him.
It was a horrible way to die.
Frank Ferraro had 19 blows to the head, and Robert Napke had 18.
So after he has eliminated these two potential witnesses, he then gets the safe and takes it out to his car, struggles with it, scrapes some of the paint off the car with the safe, and drives off.
He tried to make it look like it was a racial incident by sending that devil in hell letter. And ultimately, that letter hurt him too.
The FBI has a handwriting analysis unit at Quantico in their laboratory in Virginia. And they determined through samples obtained from him and the original letter he wrote to the press as being written by the same person. That person was Edmund Emmerich III, and no other.
Emmerich was ultimately indicted for an aggravated robbery, 2 counts of aggravated murder. They found him guilty of all the crimes and the specifications. Emmerich was sentenced to the maximum amount of time that he can. He would now be 97 years old the first time he comes up for parole. So I don't think Emmerich's ever getting out, and he shouldn't get out.
My brother was a good, law-abiding citizen who wanted to live a simple life and have a lot of friends. To have at his funeral over 700 people, that's a homage to Robert.
Frank was a stellar person. Everybody loved him, and really he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's all. I think that was hardest for his family to come to grips with. And I get asked all the time, what's the worst case? What's the most horrible? You know, you can't rank tragedies. I mean, you can't, because everybody is important to somebody. And you got to work every case that way. You have to be dedicated to this. I won't go as far as saying it's a calling, but you certainly have to want to do this.
2 innocent men die violently for a few $100s of change money. and destroy two families in the process. Justice? Maybe. Closure? Not possible. But I'll take justice if I can't find anything else. So, Doyle Burke. He'll take the justice. Like all American detectives do. On the next American Detective.
Fire is his thing. He was going to erase his footsteps.
I realized he was a wolf in sheep's clothing.
I was shocked, and I'm like, what are you talking about?
A lot of murderers are emotional when they take a life. Not him, because he's cold as ice.
The night it happened, the air over the Gulf Coast was thick, heavy, unmoving, as if the heat itself were holding its breath, and in a quiet suburban street where porch lights flickered and cicadas screamed into the darkness, a single scream tore through the stillness and vanished, swallowed by the walls of a modest house that would soon become the center of one of Florida's most disturbing cold cases, a case that would lie dormant for 2 decades, festering beneath layers of dust, silence, and fear, waiting for a single crack in a family's carefully guarded secret to finally expose the truth. At 11:47 p.m., a neighbor dialed 911, reporting strange noises, a muffled cry, then nothing, only the steady hum of air conditioners and the distant roar of traffic from the highway. When deputies arrived minutes later, they found the front door ajar, the living room lights still on, the television glowing silently in the corner, and no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, no broken glass, only a purse lying abandoned on the coffee table and a half-filled glass of iced tea sweating onto a coaster, as if its owner had stepped away for just a moment and never come back. Her name was Laura Bennett, 34 years old, a mother of one, a real estate assistant, known in her community for her quiet warmth and relentless routine, the kind of woman who never missed school pickups, who always waved to neighbors, who never left a drink unfinished on the table. Yet that night, Laura vanished into thin air, leaving behind a house that looked frozen in time, a child asleep in the next room, and a husband who would return home hours later to find his world irreversibly altered. By dawn, the street was sealed off with yellow tape. News vans lined the sidewalks. Deputies moved through the house in latex gloves, documenting every inch, photographing every shadow, collecting fibers, fingerprints, and unanswered questions. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear motive, no immediate suspects, just a missing woman and a family plunged into instant, paralyzing dread. Search teams fanned out across nearby woods, canals, and vacant lots. Helicopters combed the coastline. Divers plunged into murky retention ponds. Volunteers distributed flyers in shopping centers and gas stations, their faces strained with disbelief. Laura's photograph stared out from every bulletin board, her eyes bright, her smile soft, her life suddenly reduced to a grainy image and a phone number to call if seen. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Each sunrise brought hope. Each sunset took a little more of it away. The case grew cold fast, not for lack of effort, but for lack of answers. Investigators traced Laura's final phone calls, interviewed coworkers, neighbors, friends, and distant relatives. No one had heard her express fear. No one had noticed anything unusual. Her financial records were clean. No one explained withdrawals. No secret accounts. No signs of planning an escape. Her car remained in the driveway. Her passport untouched. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Laura had vanished without leaving a trail. Her husband, Michael Bennett, stood at the center of the storm, a quiet man with tired eyes and a carefully controlled voice. He told police he had been working late, closing a deal across town. His alibi checked out. Surveillance footage placed him miles away at the time of the disappearance. Co-workers confirmed his presence. Time-stamped receipts and security logs seemed airtight. He returned home just after 1 a.m. to find the house eerily silent, the front door open, and his wife gone. Grief poured from him in carefully measured waves. He pleaded on camera for Laura to come home. He stood beside her parents during candlelight vigils. He clutched their young son at press conferences, promising he would never stop searching. And for a while, the community believed him.
They had no reason not to.
He was, after all, another victim of a crime too cruel to comprehend. But in the shadows, doubts began to surface, faint at first, then persistent. Detectives noticed subtle inconsistencies in his timeline, tiny discrepancies in his recollection of the night. Nothing solid, nothing provable, just an unease that lingered long after interviews ended, a nagging feeling that something was being carefully withheld. Still, without physical evidence, without a body, without witnesses, the investigation stalled. Leads dried up. Tips became sporadic. Funding dwindled. The case files grew thick, then heavier, then untouched, relegated to metal cabinets where they would gather dust for years. Laura's son grew up with a fading photograph and a story that never changed. His mother had disappeared, and no one knew why. The neighborhood slowly reclaimed its normal rhythm. New families moved into old houses. Fresh, paint-covered, faded memories. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Doors locked a little tighter. Lights stayed on a little longer. Mothers held their children a little closer. And every time a woman went missing in the region, whispers of Laura Bennett returned, a ghost story without an ending. Years slipped by, and the case transformed into a cautionary tale, a headline from another era, a tragedy invoked whenever someone spoke of unsolved crimes and unanswered prayers. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. The trail went cold, colder than anyone believed possible. Until a single phone call shattered the silence. It came in the fall of 2022, 2 decades after Laura's disappearance, a trembling voice on a recorded line, a woman in her late 50s who had lived her life under the weight of a secret that had begun to suffocate her. She did not give her name at first. She asked only if the Laura Bennett case was still open. When the dispatcher said yes, the line went quiet, as if she were bracing herself against an invisible blow. Then she spoke 4 words that would reignite a dormant investigation and send shockwaves through a community that thought it had already grieved all it could. It was someone close. Detectives listened as the caller described fragments of conversations overheard long ago, arguments that never made sense at the time, a family conflict buried beneath layers of loyalty and fear. She spoke of a night in 2002 when a relative returned home shaken, clothes damp, knuckles bruised, eyes burning with panic, muttering about mistakes that could never be undone. She spoke of hurried late-night laundry, of trash bags taken out before dawn, of a silence that followed, thick and unbreakable. Her story was incomplete, riddled with hesitation and guilt, but it was enough to pull the file from the cabinet and thrust it back into the light. Cold case detectives reopened every box, replayed every interview, re-examined every photograph. Forensics, once limited by the technology of the early 2000s, were now sharpened by decades of scientific advancement. Fibers collected from Laura's couch were retested. Partial fingerprints, once useless, were run through updated databases. Minute traces of DNA, invisible to the naked eye, were coaxed from aging evidence and subjected to powerful new analysis. Slowly, painfully, a picture began to emerge, one far darker and more intimate than anyone had imagined. Investigators discovered that beneath the polished surface of the Bennett household, tensions had simmered for years. Financial strain, unspoken resentment, a marriage quietly unraveling behind closed doors. Friends recalled subtle changes in Laura's demeanor in the months before she vanished, fleeting comments about feeling trapped, about arguments that spiraled out of control, about fear she couldn't quite explain. Then came the discovery that would tilt the entire case on its axis, a hidden series of emails buried in an old server backup, exchanged between Laura and a confidant, revealing plans to leave, to start over, to escape a life she no longer recognized as her own. The messages hinted at confrontation, at a final conversation she dreaded but knew she could not avoid. The night of her disappearance, Laura had told a friend she needed to have one last talk with someone in her family. Someone she trusted. Someone she lived with. The investigation narrowed with chilling speed. The pieces, scattered for 2 decades, now slid into place with terrifying clarity. Detectives reconstructed the hours leading up to 11:47 p.m., tracing cell tower pings, traffic cameras, and toll booth records. They uncovered anomalies in Michael Bennett's once solid alibi, discrepancies that had gone unnoticed in the fog of early investigation but now loomed unmistakably large. A receipt timestamped 10:38 p.m., once considered conclusive, was revealed to be generated automatically, not at the point of transaction. Security footage from a parking garage showed a figure resembling Michael leaving earlier than he had claimed. A license plate reader captured his car heading back toward the neighborhood far sooner than expected. The timeline collapsed, and with it, the illusion of certainty. When detectives finally confronted him again, 20 years after Laura vanished, the man who once begged the cameras for her return sat rigid in an interrogation room, his hair gray, his hands trembling. He denied everything. He repeated the same story, the same words, the same carefully rehearsed phrases. But the weight of accumulated evidence pressed in from every angle, tightening like a noose. Hours stretched into the early morning. Silence filled the gaps between questions. And then, without warning, a single name escaped his lips, a name no one expected, a name that shifted suspicion beyond him and into the depths of a family bound by blood and secrecy. The room froze. Detectives exchanged glances. Recording equipment hummed softly. Somewhere, far beyond the sterile walls of the precinct, a community slept, unaware that the truth it had waited 2 decades to hear was beginning to surface, slow and agonizing, from the shadows of a night that had never truly ended. And in that moment, it became clear that Laura Bennett's disappearance was not the work of a stranger lurking in the dark, not a random act of violence, not an unsolvable mystery swallowed by time, but the final, devastating consequence of a family secret so corrosive that it had poisoned everyone who touched it, a secret that would soon erupt into the open, dragging the past into the harsh, unrelenting light of justice. The name that slipped from Michael Bennett's lips hung in the interrogation room like a toxic cloud, heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore, and in that suspended silence, detectives felt the unmistakable shift of gravity, the moment when a cold case stops being a mystery and becomes a reckoning, because the name he uttered did not belong to a stranger, nor to a shadowy figure from the past, but to someone bound to Laura by blood, trust, and years of shared memories, a name that detonated the central assumption of the entire investigation and forced everyone in that room to confront a truth far more unsettling than any theory they had entertained before. It was her brother, Daniel Reeves. For 20 years, Daniel had lived quietly in northern Florida, a mechanic with a small shop, a wife, 2 children, a reputation for keeping to himself. He had attended Laura's memorial. He had comforted her parents. He had stood beside Michael during press conferences, his arm resting protectively across his brother-in-law's shoulders, eyes fixed on the cameras, voice steady as he pleaded for answers. No one had ever considered him a suspect. He had been family. And family, in cases like these, was often the last place anyone wanted to look. But now, the walls were closing in. Detectives reopened Daniel's old statements, combing through every sentence, every pause, every detail he had offered in 2002. Back then, his account had been simple. He claimed he was home all night, watching television, had spoken to Laura briefly on the phone earlier in the evening, nothing more. There were no glaring inconsistencies, no witnesses to contradict him, and in the absence of evidence, his words had been accepted as truth. Now, they no longer could be. Investigators pulled phone records long considered irrelevant, comparing them against cell tower data refined by modern mapping software. The results were immediate and explosive. Daniel's phone had pinged a tower less than a mile from Laura's house at 11:32 p.m., just 15 minutes before the neighbor's frantic 911 call. In 2002, that detail had meant little. Cell triangulation was imprecise, unreliable. In 2022, it was damning. They checked traffic cameras, toll records, automatic license plate readers. A grainy black and white image surfaced from a nearby intersection, time-stamped 11:21 p.m., showing a dark pickup truck matching Daniel's vehicle turning onto Laura Street. The resolution was poor, the plates unreadable, but the shape, the headlights, the distinctive dent on the rear bumper, all aligned with photographs from Daniel's insurance records. The impossible was becoming unavoidable. Detectives dug deeper, unearthing a web of family conflict long buried beneath politeness and denial. Laura and Daniel had grown up in a household marked by instability, a volatile father, a mother stretched thin, a childhood where loyalty was survival and silence was protection. As adults, those dynamics had followed them like shadows, shaping their relationships, warping boundaries, breeding resentment. Friends recalled heated arguments between the siblings, whispered disagreements that seemed disproportionate, laden with emotion no one fully understood. Laura had confided in one coworker that her brother controlled everything, that he still treated her like a child, that he refused to accept her independence. Another friend remembered Laura breaking down in tears after a phone call with Daniel just weeks before she vanished, her voice shaking as she muttered, "He'll never let me go." The picture that emerged was one of suffocating entanglement, of love twisted into possession, of protection curdled into dominance. As detectives pieced together Laura's final days, they uncovered a chilling pattern. Daniel had called her repeatedly, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early morning hours. The calls were brief but frequent, intense bursts of connection followed by long silences. On the day she disappeared, they spoke for times. The last call, logged at 10:57 p.m., lasted just 38 seconds. What was said during those seconds would never be known. When investigators finally knocked on Daniel Reeves' door, the quiet suburban street seemed to recoil. The morning sun illuminated manicured lawns and parked cars, the normality of the scene clashing violently with the storm about to unfold. Daniel answered in grease-stained jeans and a faded t-shirt, his hands blackened from engine oil, his expression flickering from confusion to guarded awareness as he recognized the badges. He listened in silence as detectives explained why they were there. He nodded, once, slowly, then stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the house was tidy, sparse, almost sterile. Family photographs lined the mantel. His children's school drawings were taped neatly to the refrigerator. A calendar hung in the kitchen, dates circled in red marker, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing, oblivious to the truth closing in. At first, Daniel cooperated. He answered questions calmly. He repeated the story he had told 20 years earlier, barely altering a word. But when detectives presented the phone records, the cell tower data, the traffic camera stills, something fractured behind his eyes. The composure cracked. His breathing quickened. His jaw tightened. He denied being near Laura's house that night. He insisted the technology was flawed. He suggested his truck had been mistaken for another. He clung to uncertainty like a lifeline. But the evidence kept coming. Investigators revealed a discovery that struck with surgical precision. Traces of Laura's DNA recovered from the fibers of a work jacket seized from Daniel's garage. The jacket, stiff with old grease and dust, had been tucked away in a plastic storage bin, forgotten, unwashed, its dark fabric still harboring microscopic skin cells transferred during violent contact. Forensics confirmed the match with near absolute certainty. The room went silent. Daniel stared at the floor, his shoulders sagging under the sudden weight of 2 decades of concealment. His hands trembled. Sweat beaded along his hairline. For a long moment, it seemed as though he might speak, might finally release the truth that had poisoned his life and the lives of everyone around him. Instead, he asked for a lawyer. The arrest came 3 days later. News broke across Florida in a wave of disbelief. Cold case solved after 20 years. Family's secret leads to shocking arrest. Brother charged in disappearance of Florida mother. Headlines exploded across screens and front pages, reviving a story many believed had faded into the past. For Laura's parents, now elderly and frail, the announcement landed like a physical blow. They had buried their daughter without a body, mourned without certainty, aged under the relentless ache of not knowing. Now, at last, there was a face to their grief, a name, a betrayal that cut deeper than any unanswered question ever could. The community reeled. Neighbors who had known Daniel for years struggled to reconcile the man who fixed their cars and waved from his driveway with a suspect accused of destroying his sister's life. His children were pulled from school as whispers spread. His wife retreated from public view, blinds drawn, doors locked, her world collapsing in on itself. But the darkest revelation was yet to come. Under mounting pressure, confronted by evidence he could no longer explain away, Daniel finally agreed to speak. The interrogation that followed would unravel a story so disturbing, so steeped in obsession and fear, that even seasoned detectives found it difficult to listen without flinching. He described a relationship defined by control, a belief that he alone could protect Laura from the dangers of the world, a conviction rooted in childhood trauma and reinforced by years of mutual dependency. He spoke of jealousy, of rage, of panic at the thought of losing her. When Laura told him she planned to leave her marriage, to move away, to start fresh, something inside him snapped. That night, he said, she had called him, her voice trembling, asking him to come over, to talk, to help her figure out what to do next. He drove without thinking, heart pounding, mind racing. The argument erupted almost immediately, years of suppressed tension detonating in a matter of minutes. Words became shouts. Shouts became shoves. And in a moment of blinding fury, he struck her. He claimed it was an accident. He claimed he never meant to hurt her. But the outcome was irreversible. Panic consumed him. He tried to wake her. He shook her. He whispered her name. When she did not respond, he believed she was dead. Fear eclipsed reason. He wrapped her body in a blanket, carried her to his truck, and drove into the darkness, the roads empty, the world asleep, bearing witness to a crime that would echo for decades. What happened next, he said, was a blur of desperation. He drove until the city lights vanished, until only marshland and mangroves surrounded him, until the smell of salt and decay filled the air. There, beneath a moonless sky, he buried her in a shallow grave near an abandoned drainage canal, the mud swallowing her, the night closing in, erasing the final trace of her existence. For 20 years, he carried that secret, a weight that bent his spine, hollowed his eyes, poisoned his relationships. Every passing day, every family gathering, every birthday and holiday, he lived with the knowledge of what he had done, the silence tightening its grip with each unspoken confession. Yet even as he spoke, investigators remained cautious. His account needed verification. His words alone could not close a case defined by absence. They needed her. They needed Laura. Search teams returned to the marshlands, guided by Daniel's fractured memories, combing through miles of thick brush and stagnant water. Drones scanned from above. Dogs tracked faint, decades-old scents. Divers plunged into black canals where sunlight never reached. For days, nothing surfaced but mud, roots, and the relentless buzz of insects. Hope wavered. Then, at the edge of a forgotten service road, beneath a tangle of vines and debris, a shovel struck something solid. The ground yielded slowly, reluctantly, as if resisting the return of its secret. Inches beneath the surface, investigators uncovered fragments of fabric, then bone, then the unmistakable outline of a human form curled inward, preserved by the wet soil, waiting in silence for a quarter of a century. Laura Bennett had been found. And in that moment, the cold case that had haunted Florida for 20 years transformed from an unsolved mystery into a devastating truth, one that would ripple outward, shattering illusions, rewriting memories, and forcing an entire community to confront the terrifying reality that sometimes the greatest danger is not the stranger in the dark, but the person standing closest, hidden in plain sight. The recovery of Laura Bennett's remains did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of torment, a final, irreversible confirmation that hope, however faint, had been an illusion sustained by grief and denial, and as forensic teams worked under the unforgiving Florida sun, carefully extracting what the earth had guarded for 20 years, the weight of that truth pressed down on everyone present, turning the air thick, the silence unbearable, every sound amplified against the stillness of a life reclaimed from oblivion. Her body lay curled on its side, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped protectively around herself, as if even in death she were bracing against fear. The blanket Daniel claimed to have used was still there, rotted and threadbare, its fibers fused with mud and roots. Nearby, shards of broken plastic suggested a tarp or trash bag, brittle from decades of decay. A rusted belt buckle lay half-buried, its metal eaten away by moisture. Every fragment was catalogued, photographed, sealed, and transported under escort, the long chain of custody that would now determine the course of justice. News helicopters circled overhead. Cameras zoomed in from behind police tape. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices trembling with the gravity of the moment. For Laura's parents, watching from a distance, the scene was unbearable. Her mother collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, while he stared blankly at the patch of disturbed earth, his face frozen, his eyes empty, as if all the years of searching had finally drained the last of his strength. In the days that followed, forensic examination began its meticulous work. Pathologists reconstructed the damage inflicted 2 decades earlier, studying fractures, tissue remnants, and bone trauma, searching for the precise cause of death. The findings were devastating. Laura had not died instantly. Evidence suggested severe blunt force trauma to the head, followed by asphyxiation. She had likely been unconscious, but alive when Daniel believed her dead, her final moments unfolding in darkness, wrapped in fabric, her breath slowly stolen by fear and suffocation. The report ignited outrage. For the first time, the full horror of her death became clear, and the community that had mourned her absence now grappled with the cruelty of her end. Vigils sprang up across the county. Candles flickered on courthouse steps. Strangers left flowers at the edge of the excavation site. The case, once a faded headline, now dominated every broadcast, every conversation, every uneasy silence. Inside the jail, Daniel Reeves sat alone in a narrow cell, the walls closing in, the echoes of his confession bouncing endlessly in his mind. But the story he had offered investigators was far from complete. Detectives sensed omissions, carefully curated gaps designed to soften his culpability. They believed others might have known, might have helped, might have kept his secret. And they were right. As prosecutors prepared charges, a second thread of the investigation began to unravel, one that would expose a deeper network of silence and complicity, a web of fear and loyalty stretching far beyond a single man. They started with Michael Bennett. Despite Daniel's confession, questions about Michael's role remained. His timeline had shifted. His alibi had eroded. His behavior in the years following Laura's disappearance had been marked by strange contradictions, fervent public appeals for information paired with quiet, abrupt retreats from private inquiries, offers of reward money followed by sudden withdrawal, a pattern of cooperation that often ended just short of revelation. Detectives revisited every interaction, every interview, every press appearance. They discovered that Michael and Daniel had spoken repeatedly in the days following Laura's disappearance, far more often than Michael had admitted. Phone logs revealed dozens of calls, some lasting over an hour, all placed late at night, all deleted from Michael's personal records but preserved in archived billing data. Under renewed interrogation, Michael maintained his innocence, but his composure faltered. He struggled to reconcile the evidence with his version of events. When confronted with the call logs, he claimed they were about supporting one another through grief. But the timing told a different story. These were not the calls of 2 men in shock. They were the calls of conspirators in crisis. Then came the testimony that would fracture the facade completely. Michael's second wife, whom he married 6 years after Laura vanished, stepped forward with information she had carried in silence for over a decade. In a sworn statement, She described a night in 2004 when Michael had woken her in a panic, trembling, drenched in sweat, muttering about mistakes, about blood, about a secret he could not escape. She recalled him whispering Laura's name over and over before collapsing in tears, begging her never to ask questions. At the time, she believed it was grief. Now, she understood it was guilt. Further interviews revealed a pattern of psychological unraveling. Nightmares, paranoia, sudden mood swings, bursts of rage followed by crushing despair. Michael drank heavily. He avoided certain roads. He refused to visit areas near marshlands. He forbade his son from asking questions about his mother, reacting with disproportionate anger whenever the subject arose. Detectives believed Michael had not participated directly in Laura's death. But evidence suggested he had known what Daniel did, perhaps within hours, perhaps days, and had chosen to protect him, to help him erase traces, to build a story strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Aiding and abetting. Obstruction of justice. Conspiracy after the fact. The family's secret was expanding. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared Daniel's case with relentless precision. They reconstructed the crime scene, using forensic modeling to simulate the violent confrontation, matching injuries to potential weapons, calculating force, trajectory, and timing. They mapped his route from Laura's house to the burial site, correlating his account with traffic camera data and fuel purchase records. They even recovered fragments of soil from his truck's undercarriage, mineral signatures aligning perfectly with the marshland where Laura lay hidden. Each piece tightened the net. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, Daniel refused to plead guilty. His defense team announced plans to challenge the confession, claiming coercion, emotional distress, and faulty memory. They argued the decades between crime and arrest had irreparably compromised evidence. They suggested alternative theories: a burglary gone wrong, an unknown assailant, a tragic coincidence. The trial would be brutal. As court proceedings loomed, the case drew national attention. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Documentaries retraced Laura's last steps. Online forums erupted with speculation, rage, and sorrow. Armchair detectives pored over transcripts, debating motives, timelines, and moral responsibility. And in the midst of this storm, Laura's son, now 25, faced the unbearable task of reconciling the mother he barely remembered with the truth of her death. He had grown up believing his father was a victim, his uncle a protector. Now both identities lay in ruins. He attended his mother's reburial, standing rigid beside the casket, his face pale, his eyes distant, as soil fell softly onto polished wood. In that moment, the abstract horror of the case crystallized into something devastatingly personal: a life stolen, a childhood erased, a legacy of silence that had warped his understanding of love and trust. The courtroom filled on the first day of trial. Reporters packed the gallery. Families sat separated by an invisible wall of betrayal. Daniel entered in shackles, his expression hollow, his gaze fixed on the floor. He did not look at Laura's parents. He did not look at his own children. He did not look at Michael. The prosecution's opening statement was relentless, a chronological dissection of obsession, control, and violence, anchored by forensic certainty and bolstered by 20 years of hidden evidence. They described Laura's final night in chilling detail: her fear, her resistance, her silent struggle beneath suffocating fabric. They framed the crime not as a momentary lapse, but as the catastrophic outcome of a lifetime of manipulation and emotional captivity. The defense countered with doubt, emphasizing the fragility of memory, the degradation of evidence, the dangers of retrospective certainty. They painted Daniel as a troubled man haunted by guilt over a tragedy he did not commit, manipulated by relentless interrogators into a false confession. But the jury saw the photographs. They heard the recordings. They watched the reconstruction animations that replayed the fatal blow, the wrapping of the body, the lonely drive into darkness. Each frame carved deeper into the collective conscience of the room. Witness after witness testified. Forensic analysts, detectives, digital experts, Laura's friends, Michael's second wife. Each voice added weight, nuance, texture, building an overwhelming portrait of guilt and complicity. As the trial stretched into weeks, one truth became impossible to escape. Laura Bennett had not simply been killed. She had been erased, systematically, deliberately, by the very people entrusted with her safety. And when closing arguments finally ended, when the jury retreated to deliberate, the entire county seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict that would not undo the past, but might, at last, acknowledge it. Because for 20 years, Laura's absence had been an open wound. Now, with the truth laid bare, that wound stood exposed, raw and unforgiving, demanding justice not just for a life taken, but for a silence that had allowed evil to endure. The jury's deliberation room became a pressure chamber, sealed tight with the weight of 20 years of lies, grief, and forensic truth, and outside its closed doors, the courthouse pulsed with nervous energy, every footstep echoing like a countdown, every whispered conversation dissolving into uneasy silence, because no verdict could restore what had been lost. Yet whatever decision emerged would define how the story would finally be written in the public memory. For 46 hours, the jurors combed through thousands of pages of transcripts, replayed hours of recorded interrogations, scrutinized grainy surveillance footage, examined forensic charts, DNA breakdowns, cell tower maps, and reconstructed timelines, arguing fiercely over details that might once have seemed insignificant but now carried the gravity of life and death. Some fixated on Daniel's confession, dissecting every pause and inflection. Others returned repeatedly to the forensic evidence, tracing the arc of a blow, the pattern of fractures, the suffocating folds of fabric. Each deliberation circled back to the same brutal certainty. Laura Bennett had not vanished. She had been destroyed, and the truth had been buried with her. In the gallery, families waited. Laura's parents sat rigid, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the jury room door, their faces etched with exhaustion and raw expectancy. Across the aisle, Daniel's wife sat with her children, their expressions hollow, stunned, as if they were watching someone else's life unravel in slow motion. Michael Bennett remained apart, shoulders hunched, gaze lowered, a man suspended between accusation and exposure, aware that whatever verdict emerged would not spare him from scrutiny. When the bailiff finally announced that the jury had reached a decision, the courtroom froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cameras lifted. Breath caught in dozens of throats. The jurors filed back in, their faces pale, eyes fixed forward, the verdict form clutched in trembling hands. Daniel Reeves stood. The foreperson's voice cut through the silence, steady but strained. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A sound like a collective exhale rippled through the room, followed instantly by sobs, gasps, muffled cries. Laura's mother collapsed against her husband, her body racked with grief and release, while Daniel's wife buried her face in her hands, her children clinging to her, their lives forever split into a before and an after. Daniel himself remained motionless, staring straight ahead, his expression vacant, as if the words had struck some impenetrable barrier inside him, echoing endlessly but never quite reaching his core. Sentencing came swiftly. The judge spoke of brutality, betrayal, and irreversible loss, of a crime that had not only taken a life but poisoned a family and scarred a community. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, a chapter closed, but the story was far from over. Because the investigation did not end with Daniel Reeves. Attention turned once more to Michael Bennett. The evidence against him, while insufficient to prove direct involvement in Laura's death, painted a chilling portrait of complicity. Prosecutors filed charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy after the fact, and evidence tampering, alleging that Michael had assisted Daniel in constructing false alibis, disposing of incriminating materials, and misleading investigators during the crucial first days of the search. The trial that followed lacked the visceral shock of the murder proceedings, but its implications were just as devastating. Witnesses described frantic late-night calls, secret meetings, hurried movements under the cover of darkness. Digital analysts reconstructed deleted messages and call logs, revealing a web of communication that contradicted Michael's repeated claims of ignorance. One exchange, recovered from a damaged phone backup, sent a jolt through the courtroom. A single text from Daniel, time-stamped 3:12 a.m., 2 days after Laura vanished. "It's done. Stick to the story." Michael's response, sent 30 seconds later. "I will. For her sake." Prosecutors argued that phrase, simple and devastating, revealed everything, an understanding of what had occurred, a conscious choice to protect the killer, a deliberate commitment to deception. The defense countered with emotional appeals, framing Michael as a man in shock, manipulated by a dominant brother-in-law, overwhelmed by fear, clinging to denial. They painted his actions as misguided loyalty, not criminal intent. The jury disagreed. Michael Bennett was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 25 years in state prison. For Laura's son, the verdict delivered a second, crushing blow, the final collapse of the father he once believed had searched endlessly for his mother. Yet even as the legal machinery ground forward, the psychological aftermath spread outward, touching every corner of the community. Neighbors revisited memories, reinterpreting small gestures, offhand comments, moments of unease they had dismissed. A strange look, an awkward silence, a sudden change in routine. In retrospect, everything seemed charged with hidden meaning. The street where Laura once lived became a place people avoided, its quiet facades now heavy with invisible history. True crime enthusiasts descended, cameras in hand, recording video essays, narrating podcasts, tracing the path from house to marshland, transforming tragedy into consumable narrative. Laura's name became a keyword, her story a data point in a vast digital archive of suffering. For her parents, none of it mattered. They visited her grave daily, bringing fresh flowers, speaking to her softly, telling her about the son she never saw grow up, the justice that finally arrived, the world that had not forgotten her. They carried guilt alongside grief, guilt for not seeing the warning signs, for not pushing harder, for trusting those who betrayed their daughter so completely. But perhaps the most haunting transformation unfolded within Daniel Reeves himself. In prison, stripped of identity, reduced to an inmate number, he began writing letters, hundreds of them, addressed to no one, pages filled with fragmented memories, half-confessions, obsessive justifications, desperate apologies. Psychiatrists described him as deeply traumatized, trapped in cyclical rumination, reliving the night of the murder over and over, unable to escape its gravitational pull. In one letter, later leaked to the press, he wrote, "I thought I was protecting her. I thought I was saving her. But I became the thing I feared. I killed the only person I ever loved." The words ignited debate. Some saw them as hollow, self-serving, an attempt to reframe obsession as devotion. Others recognized the disturbing sincerity of a man who had never learned the difference between love and control. Michael Bennett, incarcerated in a different facility, remained largely silent. He declined interviews.
He refused to write.
He avoided therapy. Former friends described him as a ghost, moving through prison corridors with eyes fixed on the ground, speaking only when necessary, carrying a silence heavier than any confession. And Laura's son? He left Florida. Within months of the verdict, he sold his childhood home, packed his belongings, and vanished from the state, seeking anonymity in a place where his last name carried no history. In rare statements, he expressed gratitude for the truth, but admitted it had cost him everything he believed about his family. "I lost my mother twice," he said once. "And I lost my father the day I learned he chose silence over her life." Years passed. The headlines faded. The news vans moved on. Another cycle of tragedies replaced this one. But in Florida, the Bennett case lingered, a cautionary tale taught in criminal justice classes, dissected in forensic seminars, cited in debates about cold case funding and technological evolution. Because Laura's story was not only about murder. It was about time. About how decades of silence can calcify into reality. About how truth, buried deep enough, can seem permanent until one trembling voice shatters the illusion. About how technology, patience, and human persistence can reach across generations, exhuming not just bodies, but secrets. And yet, even with justice served, a residue of unease remained. Detectives who had worked the original investigation confessed to sleepless nights, haunted by the knowledge that had they possessed today's tools, Laura might have been found alive. They revisited old cases, wondering how many more truths lay buried, waiting for someone brave enough, desperate enough, or weary enough to finally speak. Because the most unsettling aspect of the Bennett case was not the violence. It was the silence. The long, deliberate quiet that enveloped an entire family, enabling a killer to walk free, to build a life, to raise children, to be trusted, all while carrying the weight of an unspeakable act. A silence reinforced by fear, loyalty, denial, and the terrifying power of shared secrets. In the end, Laura Bennett's story became a testament to the endurance of truth. It waited. It endured 20 summers, 20 winters, thousands of ordinary days stacked atop one another, pressing down on a single patch of marshland, compressing memory into soil, grief into dust, hope into shadow. And then, finally, it rose. Not in a sudden eruption, but in a slow, agonizing ascent, clawing its way back into the light, forcing the world to look, to listen, to remember. Because some stories refuse to remain buried. And some secrets, no matter how deeply concealed, are never truly safe from the relentless, unforgiving passage of time. Even after the verdicts, even after the sentences were handed down and the headlines faded, the case refused to settle, lingering in the collective psyche like a low, persistent hum, because justice, once delivered, does not erase the pathways that led to the crime, and in the months that followed, investigators began to uncover a deeper, more unsettling reality. The Bennett tragedy was not a singular explosion of violence, but the final rupture of a pressure system that had been building for decades, invisible, ignored, and dangerously misunderstood. New testimonies surfaced. Friends who had once remained silent came forward, emboldened by the exposure of truth. Old acquaintances spoke of Laura's childhood, painting a portrait far removed from the warm, composed woman the public had known. They described a home ruled by volatility, sudden anger, and emotional manipulation. They spoke of a father whose moods dictated the emotional weather of the household, and a mother who coped by retreating inward, leaving her children to navigate fear on their own. In that vacuum, Daniel had assumed a role he never relinquished: protector, enforcer, controller. From a young age, he decided it was his responsibility to shield Laura from harm, but that protection came at a cost. He monitored her friendships. He interrogated her romantic interests. He positioned himself as her sole confidant, isolating her from others through subtle criticism and relentless presence. Over time, the line between care and possession blurred beyond recognition. Laura's diaries, discovered in a locked trunk in her parents' attic, revealed the internal toll of that dynamic. Page after page chronicled her struggle to assert independence, her guilt over wanting distance, her fear of Daniel's reaction if she ever truly broke free. In one entry, dated just weeks before her disappearance, she wrote, "I love him, but I'm scared of him.
He doesn't hear me.
He hears what he wants. I don't think I'll ever be free unless I leave everything behind." Those words landed with devastating clarity. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution later described the relationship as a classic case of coercive control, a psychological entrapment where emotional dependency is cultivated until escape feels impossible. Daniel's obsession, they argued, was not romantic, but territorial, a desperate attempt to maintain authority in a world that had stripped him of certainty and power. When Laura married Michael, the fragile balance fractured. To Daniel, the marriage represented a theft, an intrusion into a bond he believed belonged solely to him. While Michael initially appeared to buffer the siblings' intensity, tensions quickly resurfaced. Daniel criticized Michael's career, his finances, his parenting. He inserted himself into marital disagreements, framing his involvement as concern, while steadily undermining Laura's autonomy. As the marriage deteriorated, Daniel's influence deepened. Laura confided in him about her doubts, her fears, her desire to escape. And each confession tightened the trap. Instead of encouraging independence, he reinforced her reliance, positioning himself as the only one who truly understood her, the only one she could trust. By the time she decided to leave, the emotional stakes had become lethal. The night of her disappearance, according to forensic reconstruction, was not a spontaneous eruption, but the inevitable collision of years of unresolved conflict. Detectives recreated the scene, the living room dimly lit, Laura's voice trembling, Daniel pacing, fists clenched, his words sharp, accusatory, desperate. She told him she was leaving, that she could not live this way anymore, that she was taking her son and starting over. To Daniel, it was annihilation. Witnesses described him later that night as pale, shaking, barely coherent, his hands smeared with dirt and grease, his eyes hollow. One former co-worker recalled him arriving at the garage before dawn, scrubbing his truck obsessively, muttering under his breath, his movements frantic, erratic, as if trying to erase not just physical traces, but memory itself. That behavior, once dismissed as stress, now read like confession. As the psychological contours of the case sharpened, experts weighed in on the nature of delayed justice. They spoke of the unique cruelty of cold cases, how the passage of time magnifies suffering, how unresolved grief calcifies into chronic trauma, shaping identities, relationships, entire lives. Laura's parents embodied that truth. Her mother, once vibrant and outspoken, had become withdrawn, her world narrowed to the boundaries of unanswered questions. Her father aged prematurely, his posture stooped beneath invisible weight. For 20 years, they lived in a state of suspended mourning, unable to move forward, unable to let go, trapped between hope and despair. When Laura's remains were finally returned, they described it as both a blessing and a wound reopened. Closure, they said, was a myth. What they experienced instead was a reckoning, the finality of death, the permanence of loss, the irrevocable realization that no amount of justice could restore the life stolen. Yet amidst the sorrow, a fierce resolve emerged. They became advocates. Laura's parents began speaking publicly about cold case funding, urging lawmakers to invest in forensic technology, to preserve evidence, to revisit unsolved crimes. They testified before legislative committees, their voices trembling but unwavering, reminding officials that behind every case file lay a family frozen in time, waiting for a truth that might never come. Their efforts bore fruit. The state allocated new resources to cold case units, reopened dozens of dormant investigations, and implemented mandatory evidence retention policies. For families across Florida, Laura's story became a symbol of perseverance, a testament to the idea that even decades of silence could be broken. But the ripple effects extended beyond policy. Detectives involved in the case reported profound psychological impact. Many struggled with guilt, replaying early investigative decisions, questioning missed opportunities, overlooked details, technological limitations that now seemed insurmountable.
Some sought counseling.
Others immersed themselves in work, determined never to let another case slip into oblivion. One veteran investigator summarized it bluntly: "We don't just solve cases. We carry them, and some of them never let go." The community, too, grappled with transformation. Trust, once fractured, proved difficult to rebuild. Neighbors who had known Daniel for years now questioned their ability to judge character. The realization that a killer could live undetected in their midst, attending barbecues, coaching Little League, offering help in times of need, shattered the comforting illusion of safety. Parents grew more vigilant. Doors remained locked. Suspicion crept into everyday interactions. A subtle, pervasive anxiety took root, a lingering echo of the betrayal that had unfolded in plain sight. And yet, within that unease, a new empathy blossomed. People reached out to one another, checking in, offering support, forming informal networks of care. In the shadow of tragedy, connection became a quiet act of defiance, a way of asserting that community, though wounded, could still endure. For Laura's son, the journey toward healing was arduous and solitary. He enrolled in therapy, confronting years of suppressed grief and confusion. He wrestled with identity, with the question of who he was apart from a legacy of violence and deception. Slowly, he began to construct a narrative of his own, one that honored his mother's resilience rather than her victimhood. In private journals, he wrote about her as a person, not a case. He described her laughter, her patience, the way she sang softly while cooking, the warmth of her embrace. He refused to let her memory be defined solely by the manner of her death. That reclamation, he said, was his form of justice. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves faded into the anonymity of prison life, his name reduced to a number, his story absorbed into the endless archive of human darkness. Yet even there, his presence lingered, a reminder of how easily love could mutate into destruction, how trauma, unexamined and unhealed, could metastasize into catastrophe. Psychiatrists who evaluated him concluded that while he was legally sane, he suffered from profound emotional immaturity, unresolved childhood trauma, and a pathological need for control. In their assessment, his crime was not born of momentary rage, but of a lifetime of psychological entanglement that rendered him incapable of accepting Laura's autonomy. It was not an excuse. It was an explanation. And that distinction, thin yet critical, underscored the haunting complexity of the case, that monstrous acts often emerge not from monstrous beginnings, but from ordinary pain left to fester in silence. As the years passed, Laura Bennett's story settled into the collective memory of Florida, not as a simple narrative of crime and punishment, but as a layered meditation on family, loyalty, fear, and the devastating consequences of secrets. Her name was etched into a memorial wall honoring victims of unresolved violence, a silent testament to lives interrupted and truths delayed. School programs referenced her case when teaching about personal boundaries, emotional health, and the warning signs of coercive control. Support groups invoked her story as a cautionary tale, urging survivors to speak, to seek help, to refuse the suffocating comfort of silence. Because in the end, the most chilling lesson of the Bennett case was not that evil could hide for 20 years. It was that it could do so with the cooperation of love, loyalty, and fear. And that perhaps the greatest act of courage is not endurance, but exposure. The willingness to speak when silence feels safer. The determination to reveal when concealment seems kinder. The strength to confront truth, no matter how devastating. For in the long, unforgiving arc of time, it is only truth that survives. And only truth that frees. Time, once the enemy of justice, began to transform into its ally, and in the wake of the Bennett verdicts, a quiet revolution unfolded behind the scenes, one driven not by headlines or outrage, but by the relentless determination to ensure that no other family would endure the same decades of unanswered suffering. And as cold case units across Florida re-examined forgotten files, Laura's story became both a blueprint and a warning, a reminder that every dormant investigation contained a living wound. In climate-controlled evidence rooms, detectives opened boxes that had not been touched in years, sometimes decades, releasing the stale scent of paper, dust, and neglect. They sifted through brittle photographs, outdated lab reports, handwritten witness statements, and audio tapes whose magnetic ribbons were already degrading. Each file represented a moment in time when hope had burned brightly, only to be extinguished by insufficient tools, overwhelmed manpower, or the simple tyranny of circumstance. Now, armed with cutting-edge forensic technology, investigators returned to these fragments with new eyes. DNA phenotyping, genealogical databases, advanced ballistics analysis, and machine learning-driven pattern recognition breathed life into stagnant leads. Cases once deemed unsolvable began to crack. Arrests followed. Long-buried truths surfaced. And with each success, the shadow of Laura Bennett loomed, a silent testament to the power of persistence. Yet the renewed focus on cold cases also revealed a darker reality. For every story of resolution, dozens remained locked in silence, their victims still lost, their families still waiting. Laura's case, dramatic and conclusive, became an emblem, but also an exception, highlighting the countless mysteries that might never find answers. Within law enforcement, a philosophical reckoning took hold. Veteran detectives spoke candidly about the emotional toll of unresolved crimes, the corrosive effect of years spent chasing vanishing leads, the quiet despair of watching parents age and die without knowing what happened to their children. Younger officers listened, absorbing the gravity of a profession where success was measured not only by convictions, but by the ability to endure uncertainty. Training protocols shifted. New recruits were taught to treat every piece of evidence as if it might someday be all that remained. Documentation standards tightened. Evidence preservation became sacrosanct. The Bennett case, with its decades-old fibers and trace DNA, proved that even the smallest fragment could one day hold unimaginable power. For Laura's parents, these institutional changes offered a fragile sense of purpose. They founded the Laura Bennett Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for cold case resources. The foundation provided counseling, legal guidance, and financial assistance, but perhaps most importantly, it offered community, a network of people bound by shared absence and unresolved grief. Monthly meetings became sanctuaries of quiet understanding, rooms filled with photographs of smiling faces, now frozen in time. Parents spoke of sons and daughters lost to shadow. Siblings recounted the ache of birthdays uncelebrated. Spouses described empty beds and unanswered questions. In those gatherings, Laura's story was not a spectacle, but a lifeline, proof that truth, however delayed, could still arrive. Her mother often closed the sessions with the same words, "Don't let silence be your inheritance." For Laura's son, the foundation became both refuge and burden. He volunteered quietly, avoiding the spotlight, preferring to work behind the scenes, organizing records, coordinating support calls, assembling care packages for newly grieving families. In the process, he discovered a form of healing rooted not in forgetting, but in service, transforming personal loss into collective resilience. Yet the deeper he immersed himself, the more he confronted the vastness of unresolved suffering, the staggering scale of human disappearance. Each new story echoed fragments of his own, the unanswered phone calls, the hollow waiting, the slow erosion of hope. Some nights, the weight of it all pressed so heavily upon him that sleep became impossible, his mind trapped in an endless loop of imagined outcomes, alternative timelines, futures that would never exist. Therapists called it vicarious trauma. He called it inheritance. And still he persisted. Because amid the darkness, moments of light emerged. A missing teenager located alive after years in hiding, a murderer finally unmasked through genetic genealogy, a long-lost body identified, returned to waiting families. Each resolution reaffirmed his belief that no search was ever truly futile. Meanwhile, beyond Florida, the Bennett case reverberated through national policy debates. Congressional hearings cited the investigation as a case study in the necessity of long-term evidence retention, sustainable funding for forensic laboratories, and the ethical complexities of genealogical databases. Civil liberties advocates raised concerns about privacy, while families of victims argued passionately for any tool capable of delivering truth. The tension was palpable. How much privacy should be sacrificed in pursuit of justice? How far should technology be allowed to reach into personal histories? Where did the boundary lie between collective safety and individual rights? The Bennett case offered no simple answers, only a stark illustration of the stakes involved. For if not for those technological advancements, Laura's remains might still lie beneath Florida soil, her killer unpunished, her family suspended in uncertainty. As these debates unfolded, Daniel Reeves settled into the grim routine of prison life, his world reduced to concrete walls, regimented schedules, and the relentless monotony of confinement. But unlike many inmates, he did not fade quietly into obscurity. His case attracted psychologists, criminologists, and graduate students, all eager to understand the pathology of familial violence, the mechanisms by which love could mutate into annihilation. Daniel agreed to participate in extensive interviews. Over dozens of sessions, he dissected his memories, his emotions, his justifications, often circling the same moments, unable to break free of their gravitational pull. He spoke of childhood nights spent awake, listening for his father's footsteps, bracing for rage. He described the fierce protectiveness he felt toward Laura, the way it anchored his identity, gave him purpose. When she married, that purpose collapsed. "I didn't know who I was without her," he confessed. "She was my reason, my responsibility, my proof that I mattered." The admission unsettled his interviewers, revealing the fragile architecture of a self built entirely around control. Psychological assessments concluded that Daniel exhibited traits of dependent personality disorder intertwined with narcissistic vulnerability, a volatile combination where fear of abandonment coexisted with a desperate need for dominance. In such a framework, Laura's attempt to leave did not register as independence, but as existential annihilation. Understanding this did not mitigate the horror of his actions, but it illuminated the silent pathways by which ordinary pain could escalate into irreversible violence. Michael Bennett's psychological trajectory followed a different, but equally haunting arc. Incarcerated, isolated, stripped of the social validation that once sustained him, Michael confronted the emptiness beneath his carefully maintained facade. Letters to prison counselors revealed a man drowning in remorse, not only for his complicity, but for the years of emotional neglect that had eroded his marriage long before it ended in bloodshed. "I thought silence was mercy," he wrote. "I thought protecting my son from the truth was love. But all I did was teach him that lies are safer than honesty." His reflections, though sincere, arrived too late to repair what had been destroyed. Their son never visited. He refused phone calls. He declined letters. For him, reconciliation felt like another betrayal, another concession to a past that had already taken too much. Yet even as individuals grappled with the aftermath, the broader cultural resonance of the Bennett case deepened. Documentaries explored the psychology of coercive control. Educational programs integrated its lessons into curricula about emotional abuse and family dynamics. Advocacy groups cited it in campaigns to raise awareness about the subtle warning signs of unhealthy attachment, isolation, possessiveness, emotional manipulation, disproportionate jealousy. Because the most chilling aspect of Laura's story was not the brutality of her death, but the ordinariness of its origins. There were no ominous strangers, no shadowy conspiracies, no exotic motives. Only a family dynamic warped by fear and silence, allowed to fester until it erupted into catastrophe. That realization unsettled audiences more profoundly than any sensational detail ever could, for it suggested that the boundary between safety and horror was far thinner than anyone wished to believe. As years passed, anniversaries of Laura's disappearance and recovery became moments of quiet reflection rather than spectacle. Her foundation hosted candlelight walks along coastal trails, their flickering lights mirrored in the dark water, each flame representing a life touched by unresolved loss. In those gatherings, silence held a different meaning. It was no longer the suffocating void of unanswered questions, but a collective pause, a shared acknowledgement of pain, resilience, and enduring connection. And in that silence, Laura's presence felt strangely tangible, as if her story, once buried, now flowed through the lives she continued to shape. Yet even with all that had been achieved, an unsettling awareness persisted. The Bennett case, for all its resolution, was a reminder of how easily violence could hide, how effortlessly truth could be postponed, how fragile justice truly was. For every secret exposed, countless others remained concealed. For every confession, innumerable silences endured. And somewhere, in some quiet neighborhood, beneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life, another story might already be unfolding, its first chapters written in fear, its ending yet unknown. Because the legacy of a cold case is not closure. It is vigilance. The relentless commitment to look beyond appearances, to question comforting narratives, to listen when something feels wrong, even when the truth threatens to dismantle everything we believe. In the long echo of Laura Bennett's story, that vigilance became both warning and hope, a reminder that while time may conceal, it also reveals, and that no secret, however deeply buried, is immune to the slow, patient advance of truth. Not forever. In the years that followed, the echo of Laura Bennett's story began to drift beyond the borders of Florida, seeping into the national consciousness, not as a single tragedy, but as a lens through which countless other unresolved disappearances were suddenly seen more clearly, and in that widening reflection, the boundaries between past and present blurred, until every cold case seemed to whisper the same question. How many truths were still buried, waiting for the courage, the technology, or the accident of timing to finally surface? Families across the country reached out to the Laura Bennett Foundation, their letters heavy with desperation and fragile hope. They wrote of missing daughters, sons, sisters, and spouses, their lives suspended in a limbo that never ended. They asked for guidance, for resources, for anything that might bring movement to cases long dismissed as unsolvable. Some sent photographs, their edges softened by years of handling, faces smiling out from a time when everything was still possible. Each envelope was a testament to endurance. Each story, a reminder that Laura's fate was not an anomaly, but part of a vast, uncharted landscape of human loss. Within law enforcement, a quiet shift occurred. Detectives began collaborating across jurisdictions, sharing databases, cross-referencing evidence, building networks that transcended departmental boundaries. Cold case conferences, once sparsely attended, now filled entire convention halls, buzzing with cautious optimism and technical ambition. Specialists presented breakthroughs in genetic genealogy, isotope analysis, forensic anthropology, and digital reconstruction. They spoke of reconstructing faces from bone fragments, tracing ancestral lines through microscopic strands of DNA, resurrecting corrupted data from obsolete storage media. Every advancement carried the promise of illumination, and with it, the weight of responsibility. Because each discovery had the power to rewrite lives. In one such conference, a detective from Oregon described identifying a Jane Doe from the 1980s using genealogical triangulation, returning her remains to a sister who had searched for 40 years. In another, a Texas investigator detailed the capture of a serial offender after decades of anonymity, his crimes hidden behind shifting identities and geographic distance. The room listened in reverent silence, absorbing the magnitude of what was now possible. And always, somewhere in those discussions, Laura Bennett's name surfaced, a benchmark, a catalyst, a reminder that perseverance, however delayed, could still triumph. Yet for all the progress, an undercurrent of unease persisted. Ethicists warned of unintended consequences. Privacy advocates cautioned against the unchecked expansion of genetic databases. Legal scholars debated the admissibility of evidence derived from indirect familial matches. The promise of justice collided with the fear of surveillance, and the line between salvation and intrusion grew increasingly thin. In quiet corners of academia, philosophers pondered the implications. When technology renders the past transparent, what becomes of forgetting? When secrets are no longer safe, how does society reconcile accountability with mercy? These questions had no easy answers. And Laura's story, with its devastating clarity, offered no refuge from their complexity. For her parents, now aging into their 80s, time moved differently. Each day felt both borrowed and immeasurably precious. They continued their advocacy, but their focus gradually shifted inward, toward memory, toward preserving Laura as more than a symbol, more than a case study. They began assembling an archive of her life. Photographs, school projects, handwritten notes, recipe cards smudged with flour and grease, cassette tapes of childhood laughter. They cataloged every fragment, every trace, building a sanctuary of remembrance that defied the erasure of violence. Visitors often remarked on the warmth of the space, the way it pulsed with life despite its somber origins. And in that quiet room, Laura's presence felt whole again, no longer fragmented by headlines and court transcripts, but restored to the fullness of her humanity. Her mother once said, "They took her future. They don't get her past." For Laura's son, adulthood unfolded in layers of cautious reconstruction. He built a career in digital archiving, drawn instinctively to the preservation of fragile histories. He specialized in restoring corrupted files, rescuing data thought lost to technological decay. In his work, colleagues recognized an unusual patience, an almost reverent attention to detail, as if he understood, more deeply than most, the cost of disappearance. He rarely spoke of his family, but in private he wrote short, sparse entries, reflections on memory and identity, fragments of dreams where his mother appeared unannounced, standing at the threshold between worlds, smiling softly, as if to reassure him that she was finally at peace. These writings became his private ritual, a way of maintaining connection without reopening wounds. He did not seek closure. He sought continuity. And in that pursuit, he discovered a fragile equilibrium, a balance between honoring the past and inhabiting the present. Meanwhile, within prison walls, Daniel Reeves aged rapidly. The years stripped him of strength, of resilience, of illusion. His hair thinned, his gait slowed, his once controlled demeanor eroded under the monotony of confinement. Yet his mind remained active, restless, circling endlessly around the moment of rupture that had defined his existence. In therapy sessions, he often spoke of time as an adversary, an unrelenting force that magnified regret rather than diminishing it. "I thought distance would dull it," he confessed once. "But it sharpens. Every year it sharpens." He dreamed of Laura constantly. In some dreams, she forgave him. In others, she turned away in silence. In all of them, she remained just beyond reach, an unattainable presence that haunted his waking hours. Psychologists described his mental state as a cycle of obsessive rumination and profound remorse, a psychological purgatory from which there was no escape. Yet even within that confinement, Daniel became a strange symbol. Other inmates, drawn to the notoriety of his case, sought him out, probing for details, for stories, for the thrill of proximity to infamy. He rebuffed them, retreating further into isolation, preferring the company of books and memory to the brutal hierarchies of prison life. In that solitude, he began writing again, filling notebooks with reflections, confessions, and apologies never sent. Some pages were addressed to Laura, others to her son, most to no one at all. In those lines, he grappled with the boundaries between intention and outcome, love and possession, fear and violence. Whether these writings represented genuine insight or another form of self-justification remained a matter of debate. But they revealed a mind consumed by the irrevocability of a single night. Michael Bennett's decline was quieter. Prison stripped him of the performative roles that had once defined his identity: husband, father, grieving widower. In their absence, he confronted an emptiness he could neither articulate nor escape. Former inmates described him as withdrawn, rarely speaking, spending hours staring at the concrete floor of the recreation yard, as if searching for something buried beneath its surface. He refused counseling. He declined educational programs. He served his sentence in near total silence. To some, this withdrawal appeared as penance. To others as cowardice. But to his son, it was irrelevant. The rupture between them remained absolute. And so, the Bennett family story fractured into parallel trajectories, each shaped by the same origin, yet diverging irreversibly. For the community, the case slowly receded from daily consciousness, its details fading into the archive of collective memory. New developments commanded attention. New tragedies unfolded. Yet beneath the churn of headlines, Laura's story retained a subterranean presence, resurfacing whenever another cold case cracked open, whenever another family found long-awaited answers. Her name became shorthand for endurance, for patience, for the idea that even the deepest silence could, eventually, be broken. And perhaps that was the most enduring legacy of all. Not the spectacle of arrest, not the drama of trial, but the quiet, persistent insistence that truth mattered, regardless of time, regardless of cost. That every missing person was more than a statistic, more than a photograph, more than a headline. They were a life, a network of relationships, a universe of unrealized possibilities. And somewhere, beneath layers of earth, data, and denial, their stories waited, waiting for the moment when someone would finally listen. Because in the long shadow of Laura Bennett's disappearance, one lesson endured with chilling clarity. Silence is never empty. It is filled with echoes. And sooner or later, those echoes demand to be heard. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Nearly half a century of waiting had led to this moment, and now, as Thomas Calder was escorted through the narrow aisle in shackles, the weight of 47 years pressed down on every soul inside. The wooden benches creaked under the shifting bodies of spectators, journalists, and family members who had waited most of their lives to witness this single, irreversible scene. The air was thick with anticipation, sorrow, anger, and disbelief, all tangled together in a suffocating knot that no one could untie. Emily Harper's family sat in the front row. Her younger sister, now older than Emily ever got to be, clutched a faded photograph with trembling fingers. Her parents, long since buried, were not there to see justice finally arrive, and that absence haunted the room as fiercely as the presence of the accused. Generations had grown, lives had unfolded and collapsed, entire histories had been written since Emily vanished into the darkness of that October night. Yet for this family, time had never truly moved forward. It had only circled endlessly around one unresolved question: what happened to Emily? Now they knew, and the truth burned. Thomas Calder looked smaller than anyone expected. Age had bent his spine and drained the color from his skin. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the edge of the defense table, eyes fixed on the polished surface, refusing to meet the gaze of the people he had scarred forever. The monster from the cold case files did not resemble the image that haunted the town's nightmares. But the horror of what he had done lingered in the silence between every breath. The judge entered. The room rose. Then, slowly, everyone sat again. The trial of one of Florida's oldest reopened cold cases had officially begun. The prosecution opened with a voice that cut through the air like a blade. Each sentence was deliberate, precise, unflinching. They reconstructed the timeline of Emily's final hours, step by step, minute by minute, painting a vivid portrait of a girl walking home under fading streetlights, unaware that someone was watching her from the shadows. The words landed heavily, forcing the audience to relive that night as if it were unfolding in real time. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as forensic evidence, once buried by decades, was laid bare under the harsh glare of modern science. The fragment of red fabric, the DNA profile,
the broken alibi,
the false identity, the confession. Each piece fell into place with terrifying clarity. Expert witnesses testified about technological breakthroughs that transformed microscopic traces into undeniable proof. Analysts explained how genealogical databases had reached back through bloodlines to expose a man who believed he had outrun history. Detectives described the long, obsessive pursuit that led them across state lines, through forgotten records and decaying memories, until finally, the truth emerged. Then came the photographs. The screen flickered to life, revealing images from the original investigation, grainy, faded, but unmistakably real. A stretch of road swallowed by darkness. A forest trail disappearing into tangled undergrowth. A shallow grave concealed beneath decades of fallen leaves. The room remained silent, yet the emotional weight was deafening. Some viewers turned away. Others stared, frozen, unable to look or to escape. When Emily's remains were shown, her sister closed her eyes, tears sliding soundlessly down her cheeks. The defense offered little resistance. The evidence was overwhelming. Their strategy shifted from denial to mitigation, attempting to frame Thomas Calder as a man destroyed by mental instability, warped by isolation, driven by impulses he could not control. They spoke of childhood trauma, of broken homes, of untreated psychological disorders, searching desperately for reasons that might soften the verdict. But no explanation could undo the damage. When it was time for Thomas Calder to speak, he rose slowly, gripping the stand as though it were the only thing holding him upright. His voice was hoarse, barely audible at first. He claimed remorse. He spoke of regret, of nightmares that followed him across decades and identities, of a life spent in constant fear of exposure. He said Emily's face never left his mind. But remorse, after 47 years of silence, sounded hollow. Then came the victim impact statements. Emily's sister stood, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to break through. She described birthdays without her sister, holidays that felt incomplete, parents who aged under the crushing weight of uncertainty, and a life forever shaped by unanswered questions. She spoke of the childhood bedroom left untouched for years, the empty chair at family dinners, the haunting hope that maybe, just maybe, Emily would walk through the door. She turned to face Thomas. "You stole more than her life," she said. "You stole our future." Her words echoed through the chamber, embedding themselves into every crack of the courtroom walls. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, no one was surprised.
Guilty.
On all counts. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Thomas Calder closed his eyes. For a brief moment, the courtroom felt suspended in time, suspended between justice and irreparable loss. Then the sound of restrained sobs filled the room, breaking the silence like glass. Outside, the world continued as it always had. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. Children laughed on distant playgrounds. But inside that courtroom, a story that began in fear, darkness, and unanswered questions had finally reached its legal conclusion. Yet something remained unresolved. Because even with a conviction, even with a confession, the true depth of the tragedy refused to settle neatly into place. Investigators soon uncovered disturbing inconsistencies in Thomas's account. Details that shifted, timelines that bent, locations that blurred. It raised a chilling possibility that Emily Harper's murder might not have been his only secret. Digging deeper into his past, detectives discovered a string of disappearances along his known travel routes in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Young women, similar profiles, similar circumstances, cases that had long gone cold. Each one whispered the same terrifying question. Was Emily the first or simply the one who was finally found? The shadows surrounding Thomas Calder deepened, stretching far beyond the boundaries of a single crime. And as investigators reopened files in multiple states, the possibility emerged that the closure of one cold case had merely cracked open the door to many more. For Emily's family, justice had finally arrived, but peace remained elusive. The scars of nearly 5 decades could not vanish with the reading of a verdict. Grief, once ignited, never truly extinguishes. It only changes shape, settling quietly into the corners of daily life. In the end, the courtroom emptied. But the echoes of that trial continued to reverberate through the community, through the halls of law enforcement, through the memories of those who had waited so long for the truth. And in those echoes lived one final, haunting realization. Some cold cases do not end. They only reveal how deep the darkness truly runs. The verdict should have ended everything. The doors of the courtroom had closed. The sentence had been spoken. The chains had tightened around Thomas Calder's wrists. By every legal definition, the case was over. And yet, within days, investigators began to feel an unsettling pull back into the darkness, as if something vital still lingered beyond the edges of the truth, waiting to be uncovered. It started with a single file pulled from a forgotten archive, then another, and another, until the silence surrounding Thomas Calder's past began to fracture, releasing whispers of crimes that might never have been connected until now. Detectives revisited every known address, every workplace, every brief residence he had ever occupied. They mapped his movements across decades, tracing his trail from Florida to Minnesota, from Arizona to Nevada, overlaying it against a disturbing pattern of unsolved disappearances. Each on the map felt like the pulse of a hidden heartbeat, slow but persistent, echoing the possibility that Emily Harper had not been alone in her fate. In northern Wisconsin, a missing persons case from 1981 suddenly resurfaced. A 19-year-old waitress named Lillian Moore had vanished after finishing a late shift. Her car was found abandoned near a remote highway rest stop. No witnesses, no suspects, no body. The location fell precisely within Thomas Calder's known travel corridor. The date matched a gap in his employment history. It was the first of many coincidences that refused to be ignored. Then came a case from Iowa, 1983. A college student, Rebecca Hale, last seen hitchhiking near a service station. Her disappearance had sparked a brief media frenzy before fading into obscurity. Again, Thomas Calder's name surfaced in employment records from a mechanical repair company operating in that exact region at the time. Another overlap. Another chill. One by one, these long-dormant cases were pulled into the light. Forensic teams re-examined evidence that had once been considered useless. Fibers, degraded biological traces, partial fingerprints. Technology had transformed the impossible into the inevitable. And slowly, patterns began to emerge, stitched together by the same invisible thread that had unraveled Emily's cold case. The task force expanded. Federal agencies joined the investigation. Analysts built psychological profiles based on Thomas's known behavior, uncovering a disturbing consistency. His victims were young, often alone, typically encountered in transitional spaces, bus stops, parking lots, highways, places where people briefly existed between destinations. It was in those fragile moments of vulnerability that he appeared to strike, leaving behind nothing but silence and unanswered questions. Inside his prison cell, Thomas Calder remained silent. He refused further interviews. Requests for clarification were met with empty stares. It was as if his confession had exhausted the last fragments of his willingness to speak, sealing the rest of his secrets behind an impenetrable wall of age and fear. But investigators did not need his words. The evidence was beginning to speak for itself. In a remote stretch of forest near the Wisconsin border, search teams uncovered disturbed soil in an area marked by old topographic maps and faded witness statements. The ground yielded fragments of clothing, corroded metal buttons, and eventually, human remains. The forensic report confirmed the worst. The bones belonged to a young woman, deceased for more than 40 years. Dental records identified her as Lillian Moore. The news sent shockwaves through multiple states. Media outlets exploded with headlines. The narrative shifted overnight. What had once been a singular, tragic cold case was now unfolding into the potential exposure of a serial predator whose crimes spanned decades and territories. As further sites were investigated, more discoveries followed. Not all led to bodies. Some revealed discarded belongings. Others uncovered trace DNA that aligned disturbingly close to Thomas Calder's profile. Each new finding deepened the sense that the full scope of his actions might never be fully known. Communities that had long buried their unresolved grief suddenly found themselves thrust back into the spotlight. Families who had spent decades suspended between hope and despair received phone calls that reopened old wounds. For some, those calls brought devastating confirmation. For others, they reignited agonizing uncertainty. The possibility that their loved ones' cases might finally be solved came at a terrible emotional cost. And yet, amid the darkness, there was a fragile sense of justice. For the first time, victims who had been reduced to forgotten names in dusty files were being seen again. Their stories were being told. Their disappearances were being acknowledged. The silence that once consumed them was finally breaking. In the corridors of law enforcement, the name Thomas Calder began to carry a different weight. He was no longer just the man who killed Emily Harper. He was becoming a symbol of everything that haunted unresolved investigations. The predator who slipped through cracks, the danger of imperfect systems, the devastating consequences of technological limits. His life stood as a grim reminder that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, cloaked in ordinary routines and borrowed identities. Late one night, as rain battered the windows of the task force headquarters, a young analyst uncovered something that caused the entire room to fall silent. Among digitized records from a closed highway patrol case in Arizona, she found a partial license plate number logged after a suspicious roadside encounter in 1992. When cross-referenced against historical vehicle registrations, the match led directly to a car once owned by Richard Coleman, the alias of Thomas Calder. The report described a shaken young woman who had escaped from a stranger after being offered a ride. She declined to press charges, too afraid and disoriented to pursue legal action. The incident had been dismissed as an isolated scare. Now, 3 decades later, it took on a horrifying new meaning. The shadows around Thomas Calder were growing longer, darker, and more expansive than anyone had anticipated. Each discovery raised new questions, each answer opening doors to even deeper mysteries. How many victims were there? How many families still waited in silence, unaware that their tragedies were connected? How many truths lay buried beyond reach, lost to time, decay, and the deliberate erasure of a man determined to vanish? For investigators, the pursuit became something more than a professional obligation. It turned into a race against mortality. Thomas Calder was in his 70s. His health was deteriorating. Every passing month risked the permanent loss of critical knowledge. If he died without speaking, entire chapters of horror would vanish with him. And so, the pressure mounted. Interrogation specialists returned, armed with new evidence, new strategies, new urgency. They sought not just confessions, but locations, names, memories, anything that might bring closure to the countless unanswered questions echoing across the years. But Thomas remained unmoved. His silence became its own form of cruelty, forcing victims' families to hover forever on the edge of resolution. The man who had stolen so many lives now withheld the truth itself, guarding it as fiercely as he once guarded his freedom. Yet even in that silence, the investigation pressed forward, driven by the relentless logic of science, persistence, and human determination. The cold cases he had touched were no longer cold. They burned with renewed intensity, fueled by the hope that justice, even delayed, could still reach into the darkest corners of the past. As night fell over the task force headquarters, a single question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. How many more secrets did Thomas Calder carry to the grave? And, perhaps more disturbingly, how many of his victims would never be found? The prison lights never truly went dark. They dimmed, softened, blurred into a dull, artificial twilight that erased any sense of time. In that permanent half-light, Thomas Calder spent his final months alone, sealed inside a concrete box with nothing but memory, regret, and the crushing weight of what he had done. Outside those walls, the world kept digging, searching, hoping, chasing fragments of truth that still lay buried beneath decades of silence. But inside, Thomas remained unmoved, his mind a locked vault, his past guarded by a resolve as cold as the steel bars that confined him. For the families, the weight became unbearable. Some had lived their entire adult lives in uncertainty. Others had grown old without answers. Children who once vanished into thin air had become parents in memory, grandparents in photographs, ancestors in faded newspaper clippings. Their faces, once vibrant, now existed only as echoes. And still, the search continued. Every new excavation brought both dread and hope. In Iowa, a shallow grave was uncovered along a desolate farm road. In Arizona, fragments of bones surfaced near a dried riverbed. In northern Minnesota, a torn shoe emerged from the soil of a forgotten forest trail. Each discovery triggered waves of anticipation, fear, and grief. DNA labs worked relentlessly, their fluorescent lights burning through the night, driven by the silent promise that no victim should remain nameless. Some families received devastating confirmation. Others received nothing at all. And for many, the uncertainty persisted, an open wound that refused to heal. As months passed, the task force reached a sobering realization. They might never fully know the scale of Thomas Calder's crimes. Time had erased too much. Landscapes had shifted. Construction, erosion, and human development had altered countless potential burial sites. Witnesses had died. Records had been destroyed. Entire histories had slipped beyond retrieval. Justice, it seemed, had limits. And yet, even within those limits, the impact of the investigation rippled outward, reshaping how law enforcement approached cold cases forever. Departments across the country reopened dormant files. Evidence lockers were unlocked. Old tapes were digitized. Genealogical databases expanded. New task forces were formed. The pursuit of truth gained new urgency, driven by the haunting reminder that time does not weaken evil, it merely hides it. Emily Harper's name became a symbol. Her case, once a quiet tragedy confined to a small town, transformed into a national reckoning. It demonstrated how a single strand of DNA, preserved by chance, could dismantle a lifetime of lies. How persistence could pierce through decades of darkness. How justice, no matter how delayed, still mattered. But for Emily's family, public recognition brought little comfort. They returned to a home heavy with memories, a place where her laughter once filled the hallways. Her childhood bedroom remained preserved, frozen in time. Posters still clung to the walls. Books sat untouched on shelves. A jacket hung behind the door, carrying the faint echo of her scent. These relics were both treasures and torments, reminders of what was stolen and what could never be restored. They visited her grave often, not just to mourn, but to speak. They told her about the trial, about the confession, about the verdict. They spoke of grandchildren she would never meet, of birthdays that passed without her, of lives that unfolded in her absence. They asked questions they knew would never be answered. And in the quiet between their words, they searched for peace. But peace, like truth, rarely arrives all at once. In his final year, Thomas Calder's health deteriorated rapidly. Organ failure, infections, and cognitive decline stripped away what little strength he had left. Doctors warned that his time was short. Investigators made one last attempt, assembling every unresolved case, every fragment of evidence, every unanswered question, and laid them before him in a final appeal. They spoke not of punishment. They spoke of the families. They spoke of mothers who still slept with the lights on. They spoke of fathers who visited empty graves. They spoke of siblings who aged under the burden of hope. They asked him to end the suffering, to reveal the truth, to give closure. For a long time, he stared at the photographs spread across the table. Faces of women frozen in youth. Eyes that seemed to watch him, judge him.
Wait.
Then slowly he turned away. No confession. No revelations. No mercy. A month later, Thomas Calder died in his cell, taking countless secrets with him. The news spread quietly. There were no headlines, no breaking alerts, no public spectacle. Just a brief announcement buried among countless others. Convicted murderer dies in prison at 74. For many, it felt like an ending.
For others, it felt like another theft.
The silence he left behind was deafening. Years later, Emily Harper's case is still taught in forensic academies. Her story echoes through classrooms, training halls, and conference rooms, shaping the next generation of investigators. Her disappearance, once an unsolved mystery, now stands as proof that persistence can bend time, that patience can resurrect truth, that even the coldest cases can still burn. But the deeper legacy is not scientific. It is human. It lives in the empty chairs at family tables, in the unanswered phone calls, in the photographs that never fade, in the quiet rituals of remembrance. It lives in the realization that evil does not vanish when exposed. It simply changes form, retreating into the shadows of memory, waiting to be forgotten. And perhaps that is the greatest danger of all. Because every cold case is not just a puzzle. It is a life suspended, a story interrupted, a voice silenced. And as long as there are unanswered questions, as long as there are families still waiting, as long as there are truths buried beneath layers of time and fear, the echoes of those crimes will never truly fade. Somewhere, in the silence between past and present, Emily Harper's story still lingers. A reminder, a warning, a haunting testament to the darkness that can hide behind ordinary faces, and to the fragile, relentless hope that justice, even after decades, can still find its way home. The town never truly returned to normal. It tried, the way all places do after tragedy, by repainting storefronts, reopening schools, hosting parades, and convincing itself that life could resume its familiar rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had shifted forever. The echoes of the cold case still lingered in quiet rooms, in empty streets at dusk, in the subtle tightening of a mother's grip on her child's hand. The story of Emily Harper, once whispered only in hushed tones, now lived openly in the collective memory, an invisible scar stretching across generations. Every October, as the air turned crisp and the days shortened, candles appeared along the roadside where she was last seen. They flickered against the dark, fragile flames defying the wind, mirroring the fragile hope that had carried her family through nearly 5 decades of uncertainty. Names were written in chalk on the pavement, flowers piled at the base of a solitary lamppost. And for one quiet evening, the town stood still, listening to the silence she left behind. Investigators moved on to other cases, other disappearances, other unresolved mysteries. But none ever truly escaped Emily's shadow. Her file remained on desks and in training manuals, not as a relic, but as a warning. A reminder that time is not a solution. That patience must be relentless. That even the smallest fragment, a thread, a memory, a trace of DNA, can carry the weight of truth across a lifetime. The families of the newly discovered victims gathered in modest halls and community centers, bound together by a shared grief they never asked to know. They spoke of daughters, sisters, friends, lovers, of laughter and arguments and unfinished plans. They traded photographs and stories, building a collective portrait of lives stolen before they could fully unfold. In those gatherings, the past and present collided, forming a fragile bridge of understanding and sorrow. Each name added to the list brought both a measure of closure and a fresh wave of pain. For some, answers finally arrived. For others, they never would. And in that uneven balance, the true cost of delayed justice became heartbreakingly clear. Across the country, cold cases long considered unsolvable were reopened. Evidence lockers were emptied. Old tapes were digitized. Witness statements were re-examined with new eyes. The story of Emily Harper ignited a movement, a renewed commitment to the forgotten and the unseen. Law enforcement agencies invested in forensic technology. Volunteers scoured databases, building family trees that stretched backward through time, searching for connections once invisible. Every solved case felt like a small victory against the darkness, a candle lit in a vast and endless night. Yet for all the progress, the unanswered questions remained. How many victims had never been reported missing? How many families, fractured by poverty, isolation, or fear, never sought help? How many crimes dissolved into the background noise of daily life, unnoticed, undocumented, forgotten? Thomas Calder died without speaking, but the void he left behind continued to expand, swallowing possibilities, erasing certainty. His silence became a final act of control, denying countless families the truth they had spent decades chasing. In death, he still held power, and that realization haunted everyone who had ever touched the case. Emily's sister often returned to the forest where her remains were found. The trees had grown taller. New saplings rose where old ones had fallen. Nature, indifferent to human suffering, had reclaimed the ground, weaving life from decay. She walked the narrow paths, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds, trying to imagine her sister's final moments. The fear, the confusion, the sudden, irreversible end. And then she would imagine Emily as she had been before all of it. Laughing, stubborn, hopeful. A girl who loved music too loudly and dreamed too boldly. A girl who never got the chance to become the woman she might have been. In those moments, grief softened into something quieter. Not acceptance, not peace, but remembrance. A promise that Emily would not be reduced to a headline or a case number. That her name would continue to be spoken. That her story would endure. Years passed. New tragedies filled the news. New mysteries demanded attention. But somewhere, in quiet homes and crowded cities alike, people still whispered her name when the night grew heavy. Her story became a cautionary tale told to teenagers walking home alone. A reminder of vulnerability. A lesson in awareness. A plea for caution in a world where danger often wears ordinary faces. In police academies, recruits studied the case with solemn focus. They traced timelines, examined evidence, debated missed opportunities. Each generation vowed they would do better, see faster, listen closer. They promised that no victim would ever again be abandoned to time. And yet, deep down, they knew the truth. Some cases would always slip through the cracks. Some darkness would always evade the light. That knowledge did not weaken their resolve. It strengthened it. Because if justice could arrive after 47 years, then no case was ever truly beyond reach. Late one night, in a quiet office lit only by the glow of computer screens, a young analyst paused over Emily's photograph. She studied the soft curve of her smile, the spark in her eyes, the promise of a future that never came. And for a moment, the weight of countless unsolved cases pressed against her chest. She closed the file gently and kept working, because every unanswered question carried the echo of a life suspended. Because every cold case was a story waiting to be heard. Because somewhere someone was still waiting. In the end, the legacy of the Florida 2002 cold case was not just a solved mystery or a stunning arrest. It was a transformation in how society remembered its missing. It was a reminder that the past never truly stays buried. That truth, no matter how deeply concealed, has a way of rising to the surface. And that justice, though delayed, still holds meaning. But perhaps the most haunting lesson was this: that evil rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly. It hides patiently. It waits. And when it finally reveals its face, the damage has already been done. So the town remembers. The families remember. The investigators remember. And in that remembrance, they hold onto a fragile hope that by refusing to forget, by refusing to look away, they can deny the darkness its greatest weapon: silence. Somewhere, in the stillness between memory and history, Emily Harper's story continues to breathe. A whisper in the night, a flicker of light in the dark, a voice that refuses to fade.